Afghanistan is not usually the first place you think of when you imagine massive engineering projects. Yet right now it is driving a plan that could rewrite the future of Central Asia. Thousands of workers cut through the desert while heavy machines shake the ground. The idea sounds hopeful until you realize what is at stake for 4 surrounding countries. Watch until the end to see why this bold move has created a storm no one expected. Struggling through a broken landscape. For Afghanistan, the strain had been rising for decades, and by the time recent years rolled around, the damage could be seen everywhere. Entire neighborhoods still carried the scars of more than half a century of conflict. Roads once used for trade had been torn apart. Bridges that linked communities now dipped into rivers as broken frames. Even basic services like electricity and clean water are not readily available, leaving people to make do with whatever they could find. Humanitarian groups and the World Bank reported that about half of the population was living below the poverty line. Unemployment sat at around 14%, and people were already stretched thin. Then nature added its own blow. The drought that hit in 2021 turned into the worst in almost 3 decades. It swept through nearly the entire country and crushed any hope farmers had for a good season. Snowmelt that once fed the northern lands barely showed up. Wells dropped. Reservoirs shrank. Fields dried into cracked sheets of earth. Hunger climbed quickly after that. Families in hardest-hit areas packed what little they had and moved in search of water or work. By the end of the year, the drought alone had forced about 250,000 people to leave their homes, and combined with poverty and conflict, the number of internal movements climbed to roughly 630,000. The situation did not ease with time. By 2024, more than 10 million Afghans were still living away from home, either inside the country or abroad. Hunger tied to water shortages pressed on nearly 2/3 of the population. With the economy sinking and farmlands unable to recover, leaders knew that nothing would change unless they found a way to bring water back into the north. That search led them to an old idea. Long ago, King Zahir Shah had suggested drawing water from the Amu Darya River to restore the region. The plan was shelved for years, partly forgotten, yet never fully erased. With international assistance limited, the government decided it was time to revive it. They would try to bring new water into the country even if they had to do it on their own. What came next would shape the land in a way no one could ignore. More was waiting beyond the horizon, and the full scale of it was only beginning to unfold. Afghanistan's last hope. The Amu Darya begins high in the frozen peaks of Tajikistan and travels for nearly 1,578 miles before reaching the lowlands. Its basin spans more than 206,000 square miles. Every year it delivers roughly 21 trillion gallons of water through Tajikistan, Afghanistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan. The river feeds farms and communities, which add up to about 55 million people. For Afghanistan, this body of water has become the last dependable source in a landscape battered by drought. Northern districts have watched their soil harden and their wells shrink. Farmers who once depended on seasonal runoff now wait for clouds that never gather. With each passing year, the land has felt more fragile and more exposed. The pressure pushed leaders to create a new branch of the river, and that idea turned into the Kosh-Tepe Canal. It is a massive project which stretches close to 177 miles and reaches up to 490 feet in width, with a depth of about 28 feet. To picture this, the canal is wider than a football field. The depth equals a 3-story building. The scale alone makes it one of the most ambitious undertakings Afghanistan has ever attempted. What makes it more remarkable is how it's funded. The project cost $684 million and did not rely on outside support. Afghanistan is financing the entire project domestically, unusual for infrastructure of this scale in a country where half the population lives below the poverty line. The goal is enormous. The canal is designed to bring life back to 550,000 hectares of desert. It begins at the Kaldar intake and cuts through Balkh, Yozian, and Faryab. These are regions that have struggled to keep farmland alive. If it succeeds, wheat and rice fields could return to levels that would finally make the country less dependent on imports. The race to complete Kosh-Tepe. Long before people outside the region realized what was happening, crews had already begun shaping the Kosh-Tepe Canal. Many doubted it would ever become real. They called it a dream, something too large for the rough terrain and unpredictable weather. But while the world looked elsewhere, the project moved forward with a quiet determination. The plan was bold. The canal was designed to carry more than 23,000 cubic feet of water every second, which is roughly double the flow that moves through Washington, D.C. At full strength, it could push nearly 15 billion gallons in a single day and close to 5 trillion gallons every year, lining up exactly with the country's irrigation goals. Handling so much water meant the canal could not run in a straight cut across the landscape. The terrain is unstable in places, and sudden collapses are common in dry soil that has not seen regular moisture for years. To prevent this, engineers broke the route into separate sections. Each one had to be dug on its own, checked, reinforced, then tested with water before any crew moved forward. That process allowed workers to watch how the ground responded and to catch early signs of trouble. The first part of the project ran from the Amu Darya intake toward the center of Balkh province. Even though the original schedule predicted 2 years of work, crews finished the 67-mile stretch in only 1 year and 6 months. Along that first portion stood 14 hydraulic gates. They were built tall and heavy to control unexpected floods during the rainy months and to keep the water level steady when the heat rose. The next stage pushed the canal from Balkh toward the regions of Jauzian and Faryab. By the closing months of the year 2024, a little over 80% of the digging for that phase had already been completed. That brought the entire project past the 60% mark. By then, roughly 110 miles of canal had been cut into the earth in less than 3 years. More than 10,000 workers stayed active on the project at all hours. They relied on over 3,000 pieces of heavy machinery, which included giant excavators and laser-guided surveying equipment that helped crews measure each layer of soil with precision. Every day they moved nearly 35 million cubic feet of earth, an amount that would fill more than 1,000 Olympic swimming pools. But speed came at a cost. The canal had no concrete lining, just compacted earth. Engineers chose this approach to save time and money, knowing it meant accepting higher risk of structural failure. It was a gamble. Get water to desperate farming communities quickly or spend years building a more secure structure while people went hungry. Yet even with so much progress already visible, the most demanding stage is still ahead, and what comes next will determine whether the whole project reaches its intended scale. The last stretch of the Kosh-Tepe Canal. Crews have moved into the final phase, and this part demands a different level of precision. They are laying long stretches of underground irrigation pipes, placing pump stations at key points, and building concrete bridges that will eventually allow villages on opposite sides of the canal to reconnect. At the same time, they are weaving in pipelines meant for drinking water, turning the canal into more than a channel for farmland. It is becoming a lifeline for entire communities. Most of the project already stands. Almost 2/3 is done, and the main canal itself has reached the 80% mark. By early March of the year 2025, about 143 had been excavated. By late 2024, reports indicated the digging had likely passed 150 miles as workers continued pushing forward. Water has already started flowing through many of the completed segments. People along those stretches have begun watching dry fields change color as water spreads across land that had been barren for years. But even with that progress, another challenge shadows the entire effort. Afghanistan is working with a budget that constantly feels as if it might slip through their fingers. The project has no foreign backing at all. Every dollar comes from within the country, which is unusual for a project this large. The first phase cost somewhere between $68 and $84 million, but that was only the beginning. The complete canal was originally expected to take around $684 million. By the years 2024 and 2025, the estimate climbed past $700 million as prices rose and the design expanded. That cost alone amounted to about 5% of the country's entire economic output in the year 2022, which shows how much of the nation's resources are tied to it. For perspective, the United States spends roughly 2% of GDP on all infrastructure combined. Afghanistan is dedicating 5% to a single canal. Even so, the crews keep working day and night. They know the final phase might take from the year 2026 to the year 2028 to finish, and every new structure, pipe, and bridge has to hold firm once the full water load arrives. The pressure grows as the project moves forward, and each new day brings questions about what problems might surface next. When the canal first broke, underneath the surface of all the progress, something happened that shook the entire project and set everyone on edge. The Kosh-Tepe Canal had been moving at a pace that surprised even those following it closely, but speed came with consequences. Near the end of the year 2023, a major section failed without warning. The break sent an enormous surge of water crashing into the desert. Later measurements estimated that roughly 26 billion gallons had poured straight into the dry sands, spreading so fast that workers barely had time to react. The ground swallowed the water, but the force created a new problem that no one expected. Satellite images taken soon after showed the full scale of the damage. Along the broken stretch, the canal wall had given way and created a long artificial lake. It covered about 12 square miles of the Balkh Desert. The shocking part was that the lake kept growing over the following days. Each photograph showed the body of water creeping farther out, almost as if the land was pulling more of it in. This sudden expansion raised questions among engineers watching from around the world. Specialists pointed to the same issue. The canal did not have a concrete lining. The walls were simply shaped soil, following old construction techniques that dated back to the Soviet era. Without a concrete or geotextile layer, the structure was left vulnerable. Pressure from the moving water pushed into the banks until the soil finally gave out. Everyone familiar with canal design knew this risk, yet it had still been taken. The choice to move ahead quickly came down to cost and time. The team had been working under strict budgets with a goal to get water into farming districts as fast as possible. They used a method close to dig now and line it later, which made sense in their situation, but opened the door to early failures. In countries like the United States, engineers would rarely approve such an approach. A federal irrigation project usually goes through a long process, sometimes taking 10 to 15 years, to secure every section and reinforce it before any water is released. The belief is that stability comes first. Running water through an unlined canal is viewed as inefficient because it loses flow and weakens the structure over time. But Afghanistan faced different circumstances. Delays meant lost crops. Lost crops meant communities without food. Every decision had a cost. Even so, the workers refused to slow down. Instead of shutting off the flow, they went into the damaged area and began repairs right in the water. They shored up the weak points and reinforced the broken stretch. It was the kind of repair that looked almost impossible from the outside, but they kept at it. As the water kept moving, the workers stayed in the channel, fighting to hold the project together while pushing the excavation deeper along the route. These early failures were a warning to anyone paying attention, a sign that bigger issues might rise as the canal stretches farther from its source. Afghanistan's canal and the regional threat. The water for millions of people and the power for entire cities all depend on a single river, a river that is now being pulled in a dangerous new direction. For decades, the AMU Darya Basin has been managed under an old agreement known as Protocol 566. It was created in the late 1980s by the former Soviet Union to decide how the river's water would be divided among the 4 downstream countries. Under this system, Turkmenistan receives a little over 35%, Tajikistan receives a little over 15%, Uzbekistan receives a little over 48%, and Kyrgyzstan receives less than 1%. Those numbers shaped every canal, every irrigation system, and every farming plan that followed. Yet the document left one nation completely outside the circle. Afghanistan never received a formal share despite occupying nearly 40% of the basin. Protocol 556 acknowledged Afghanistan used roughly 2.1 cubic kilometers yearly, but gave no vote or quota. After the Soviet collapse, agreements were held only among Central Asian states. Years of conflict meant Afghanistan used less than 7% of the river's flow. That era is ending. As construction on the massive canal continues, the regions downstream are preparing for the consequences. Uzbekistan stands right at the edge of this crisis. Cotton shapes almost everything in the country, from its economy to its working population. In 2021, Uzbekistan planted roughly 2.4 million acres of cotton and produced a little over 1 million tons, placing it among the top exporters in the world. Nearly 40% of the population depends on the cotton sector, and about half the labor force is linked to it in one way or another. Water loss here is not a minor issue. A 15% drop in supply can slash yields so fast that the entire chain becomes unstable. A single harvest failure can cause the nation's economic output to fall by 2 to 3% in 1 year, which is something the country cannot afford. Turkmenistan faces a similar risk. Its economy leans heavily on cotton and wheat, together forming around 10% of its national output. These crops also provide more than 1/4 of rural employment. Fields of wheat stretching across hundreds of thousands of acres rely directly on Amu Darya irrigation. This wheat is not only for trade, it is the daily meal for more than 6 million people. If water levels drop as predicted, cotton exports will weaken, and the price of bread could rise sharply. When staple crops become harder to grow, families feel the impact almost immediately, and local markets react even faster. The situation for Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan is different, but just as serious. In these countries, the river supports more than their farms. It powers their homes. About 90% of Tajikistan's electricity comes from hydropower stations linked to the Amu Darya. A large share of Kyrgyzstan's electricity works in the same way. As long as the river flows at a steady rate, turbines move smoothly and the grid stays stable. If the river begins to shrink, the effect is immediate. The turbines slow, reservoir levels fall, entire neighborhoods could face outages, and industries depending on consistent power would be forced to cut back. Factories cannot run at full strength when the light is unstable, and households cannot rely on schedules when power becomes unpredictable. This is why the growing canal in Afghanistan is creating so much unease. The 4 downstream nations are not reacting to a small shift. They are confronting the possibility of losing the water that sustains their fields, their electricity, and their daily routines. Every foot of progress on that canal changes the balance of the basin. Every mile of water rerouted forces new questions about how long the old agreements can hold. If the river weakens, the strain will not fall on one country. It will be felt across borders, markets, and industries. The vanishing sea. When people talk about the canal, the argument usually circles around politics and control, but the real danger sits in the water that feeds entire regions. Once that water is redirected, nothing stays the same, and the effects move far beyond one border. The Aral Sea is the clearest example. It once ranked as the 4th largest lake on the planet, as it spread across more than 26,000 square miles. Back then, the water seemed endless, and the fishing villages along its shore depended on a steady flow from 2 main rivers. Those rivers were the Amu Darya and the Sir Darya. Everything changed in the 1960s when both rivers began feeding massive cotton farms. Bit by bit, more water was taken than replaced. What used to be a huge lake has now collapsed into a wasteland called the Aralkum Desert. If you walk there today, the ground crunches under your feet. Nearly 14,000 square miles of dry seabed stretch out in every direction. The air feels heavy because dust rises even with the slightest wind. Thinking about this place helps explain why people are scared of what might follow if the canal pulls even more water from the Amu Darya. The river already struggles to reach the sea. In fact, it no longer fully reaches it at all. Downstream, so much water is taken for irrigation that nothing is left to complete the journey. Northern restoration efforts made some progress. The Kuk Aral Dam brought back around 1/4 of the water that had been lost. This raised the North Aral Sea's water level by 12 feet and brought fish species back. And for a moment it seemed possible to rebuild what once existed. Further south, Uzbekistan tried to heal the land with reforestation projects. But any additional cut to the river would undo the small winds and destroy any chance of saving the southern part. The problem grows even worse with the dust storms. As the ground dries, winds sweep up over 100 million tons of polluted dust every year. It is not only sand. It carries chemicals from decades of farming, including pesticides, fertilizer residues, and traces of heavy metals. People who grow up near the former shoreline deal with severe breathing problems and cancer rates, which are far above what is considered normal worldwide. The frightening part is that the dust already travels farther than most imagine. Scientists have traced these particles in Greenland's ice. They have found them settled in forests in Norway. All of this comes from one broken sea and two exhausted rivers. If the canal keeps taking water at the current pace, the destruction would not stay in one corner of the world. What begins in Afghanistan could reach families thousands of miles away, and that is only the beginning of what comes next. The project carrying a million hopes. Even with all the arguments and warnings from neighboring countries, Afghanistan views the Kosh-Tepe Canal as a chance it has never had before. For people living in the northern provinces, the idea of water running through fields that have been dry for generations feels like a doorway opening after years of being locked out. During construction, the project already changed daily life for thousands. Around 5,500 direct jobs appeared almost overnight, giving families steady income in a period when unemployment hovered around 14% in the year 2023. In towns along the route, workshops, small restaurants, and roadside stalls began to fill again because workers needed food and equipment. Even those who were not part of the construction felt the ripple of money moving through their communities. The long-term goal is even bigger. Once the canal is complete, farmers who left their homes during years of drought have a chance to return. Some of them have been waiting for this opportunity for most of their lives. Experts believe that at least 2 million people will directly benefit from the new flow of drinking water, farming opportunities, and steady employment. The potential does not end with crops. Analysts predict that as the land becomes productive again, more than 250,000 additional jobs could follow. These jobs are expected to show up in multiple areas such as irrigation work, crop storage, transportation networks, and food processing. One of the most dramatic shifts involves the change in what farmers grow. For many years, Afghanistan was known for its wide opium fields, which stretched across enormous areas. In 2022, farmers cultivated around 500,000 acres of opium poppy. Then, in April of that same year, the ban hit. The fields emptied and the numbers dropped to almost nothing. The question that followed was simple: what comes next? The government laid out a plan that centered on legal crops, especially wheat. With the new water source, the idea became more realistic. Today, around 136,000 acres have already been set aside for wheat production. Taliban officials have stated goals to make the country a wheat exporter by 2028, though international agricultural analysts question whether this timeline is achievable given climate variability and infrastructure gaps. Still, the excitement cannot hide the risks. The future of the canal depends on more than political determination. If everything goes according to plan and the project is finished by 2028, Afghanistan could enter a period of stronger agriculture and improved food security. In addition, it would have a new identity as a major supplier in Central Asia. Some even suggest the country could emerge as a breadbasket for the region. If that happens, the pressure on downstream countries will grow even heavier. None of this is simple. Every gain in one area threatens a loss in another, and people on all sides know it. Then there is the technical side. If cracks, leaks, or structural issues appear, the entire system could fall apart. Climate change adds another uncertainty. If rising temperatures drain the river faster than expected, the consequences would be severe. It would crush the hopes of farmers, workers, and families waiting for a new start. For now, the nation stands at a point where success and failure sit only a short distance apart. Everything depends on whether the water keeps flowing and whether the promises tied to this canal can survive the challenges ahead. Before you click away, help the channel grow by liking the video and subscribing for more content. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video.